Okay. Starting to see some people starting to come in. Appreciate it. We'll let a few more people come in before we get started. Looks like we're starting to get everybody in there. There we go. Perfect. Thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming to the next installment of our webinar series. This one is called Using the RPM Channel for Optimum Performance. We're going to tie together a bunch of different things with our co-host. We'll talk about him in just a second, but tying together a whole bunch of different things loosely wrapped around the RPM channel. But we'll also talk about some other pretty interesting ways of looking at data. So been looking forward to this one for a while. A couple of things just to get us up and running as everybody is kind of coming in to take care of just a few loose ends here. You've got your bar in Zoom that's across the top. Make sure you click on your Q&A button. That'll open up a question and answer box for you. You'll also want to open up your chat box. We use those in similar but different ways. In your question and answer box, what we're looking for there is questions that you think that our co-host Jonathan Goring or I can touch upon and add value to what we're looking at. If you have a question about what we're talking about, go ahead and ask it in the question and answer box. If you want to chat back and forth, which is really super powerful of what we're doing here, having fun with everybody, and I see everybody is chatting as they go. That's for the chat box. Make sure you put it in there. Down at the bottom of the chat box where you go to type in your stuff, there's a little button there that says to. Make sure you hit the little pull down menu and do all panelists and attendees. If you leave it at the default setting of all panelists, then just myself, Jonathan, and the AIM staff that's working in the background doing a fantastic job for us, answering questions, giving us links and some other things. We're the only ones that'll see that. So make sure you click and change that to all panelists and attendees. That will be very helpful. Okay. The next thing we're going to do some polls as we go, and those polls, as any of you that have been attending these webinars will know that we've been doing these every time. They really are helpful to us. Hopefully they keep you interested in doing and giving feedback and seeing what some of the other people are doing. But it really gives us some help in understanding what the next the upcoming webinars are going to be focused on. So continue to do those. I do appreciate all of you participating in that. We really do look over those results all the time, and it really does help us. So appreciate that. We've got folks in both of our Lake Elsinore office helping us answer questions with Robbie, and then in the Roanoke office we've got Cameron and Brick and Robinson helping out. So it's and then we've got Emiliano from Italy, from Milan, Italy, the author of the Race Studio software, working hard on Race Studio 3 analysis as well. So in the chat and answering your questions and answers as well. So keep all that in mind, and if you have some questions for them, you can go ahead and do that as well. Perfect. And Robbie is using the chat as he will be throughout the day. He's added a link to our YouTube video page, which is he'll be adding some links the rest of the way. Let's start off with a poll as we get ready to introduce our guest. The first poll we're going to add in here is a poll that asks you what AIM sports hardware do you use and own and use. Select all that apply. You can select multiples here. I appreciate everybody filling these in. If you enter into the other down there, and this is mainly just hardware, the main thing, not some of the different peripheral devices that go along with that, but kind of the bigger picture hardware. If you have something that's not on there, whether it's an AIM device and I don't have it listed, or if it's another brand or a different model, click on the other, and then in the chat box, type in what those other pieces are that you're using. So that'll help me, and maybe we adjust the poll at some point to start using if we see other a lot with some product that we probably ought to have in there, we'll make that change. We'll just leave that going for about another minute or so. If you've finished, if you click the submit button, that box will go away and you don't have to worry about it as much. At this point, I'm going to leave that go for a minute, but I am going to go ahead and start our introduction of our co-host today, Jonathan Goring. Jonathan's been somebody that I've known for a while, and he's a very, very good race car driver, very accomplished, as you can see on your screen there. He's a oops, let me share that, make sure that's on front. I'm going to end that polling. Let's get that out of the way, and of everybody, and let's let me make sure I've got the screen share is doing what I want it to do. Let's do that. There we go. There we go. We've got Jonathan is an accomplished race car driver, 3-time national champion. His first national championship came in 06 in the Skip Barber class, 08 in the IMSA prototype lights, another very competitive class, and then in 2015 Spec Miata SCCA runoffs champion, something that's close to my heart with my son, and winning the Spec Miata national championship in 2006 at the runoffs. So I know how hard that one is, and it's got nothing but harder since we did that back then. So Jonathan is just a stellar driver, driving instructor. Another kind of a cool thing that Jonathan does is he's got a website, JonathanGoring.com, Jonathan Goring Motorsports, where he does has services of instruction and coaching. But one of the really cool things I like there is that he's got he's got some what he calls free wisdom. There's a button on the website that says free wisdom, and he's created some documents, and there's one of them that I wanted to highlight here, and maybe Robbie will put a link up to this particular one, but it's called the Idiot's Guide to Racing Line Theory. It's one of those things that's hard to explain sometimes, and he has just done a fantastic job with this document. There's the link right there if you want to save that, click on it and save it off to the side and take a look at it. Of course, visit his website later, and there's probably another 20 or 25 documents like this. But that one there, he draws pictures, and he talks about how important it is to put the car in the right place and attack corners in the right way. And it's a very good document, so I really enjoy that. There's all Jonathan's contact information. I'm going to just kind of introduce Jonathan here and have him say a few more things about himself. But thank you, Jonathan, for coming here. I know it's been there's a lot of work preparing for these kind of things, and we do appreciate all your time. Tell us a little bit more about you, Jonathan.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you, Roger, for having me as the co-host. I've been keeping up with a lot of the webinars, mostly after the fact on the YouTube channels, but tremendously helpful for me as a driver coach, as well as, students and high performance driver education, competitive racers, super helpful on all fronts. So yeah, my background is a lot of racing, a whole lot of coaching. I wish I had more racing right now, but what can you do? So working with what I have. As Roger touched on, I started off in Skip Barber in 2006 and won the national championship in my first year, which was kind of a surprise, but at the same time, it was an accomplishment that I definitely admired. And been in and out doing the IMSA lights in 2008, and then most recently been racing Spec Miata in the Hoosier Super Tour and majors SCCA races here and there. So, it's been a lot of fun. I hardly call this work. I do enjoy it a lot. So, just kind of learning along the way. That's another thing I like about, this sport. I always compare it to bowling, for example. Bowling, you can get a 300. In racing, there's always another 10th or 100th or anything like that. So it keeps you looking for more.
You have hit the apex in a number of times, obviously by those national championships, but there always is room for improvement, always, right?
Don't worry, I've missed a few apexes.
Oh, too. Yeah, haven't we all, right? Haven't we all? Perfect. I appreciate that. I'm gonna jump in and share the next screen we're going to look at, and that is some data. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about. Obviously, with the title of this being, RPM for performance, and so we're gonna look at a number of different ways. Jonathan's gonna take some time and break down some laps and break down some, the way we look at data, some of the different tools he uses. So why we got him here to talk about looking optimum performance from RPM data. boy, listen to some of the other stuff that he does, the way he sets things up, the way all of these things is you don't get the opportunity to chat with somebody of Jonathan's level too often, and so it's hopefully everybody will enjoy some of the stuff he talks about here. So with that, Jonathan, I'm going to give remote control over to you and click right here, and you just have to click it once, and then you're off and running. We'll chat about a few different things and look at some data. What is this data that we're going to start off with? Where are we at? What is it? How does all this work?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. So the first bit of data that we're going to look at is from a spec Miata at Sebring. This was from the PBOC Winterfest this January. It's a driver who I work with quite a bit. He's a member over at the Lime Rock Drivers Club, but wanted to shake off the winter rust and go attend that event. And shake off the rust he did. There's a few mistakes in there, which we're going to look at what he did well, what he didn't do as well, where he can improve. So, like I said, this is down at Sebring, which is one of the more technical tracks. You have essentially half the track is very bumpy concrete surface, concrete slabs. Actually, it's an old airport runway. And the other half of the track is, I don't want to say the word smooth, but smoother pavement. So it's really dynamic in how you drive and how you set the car up. So, okay, we're going to dive right into it here. I wanted to talk just briefly about the user profiles right here. The user profiles is super handy for setting up the screen the way you want it to. I know that it was, I think you had a whole webinar based on setting up your user profiles. But just real quickly, what it does is it enables you to put your measures graph where you want it. You can pop up a GPS track map. And I also like to put a channels report. So this is how I would set it up for an RPM analysis. And I'll tell you why. Number one, it's good to have a visual as to where you are on the track when you're moving the cursor around talking about the data. So very helpful for myself as a coach, but also a student if I'm coaching them. And then I also like to have the channels report tab open. For an RPM standpoint, this is a pretty critical thing to look at because what you can do is you can set up to see your RPM max. All right, so what that's going to do is that's going to show us throughout each session, each test that is loaded, all the laps, which you're going to see down here. Right, so here's your lap times, here's your lap numbers. I can even go, since we have two tests open, I can go over to test compare, and what you're going to see is both of those sessions. So you have your max and min GPS speed. I always like to kind of have that on as a default, but what we're going to be talking about today is the RPM max. The reason I have this screen set up here is to look for any outliers, right? In a spec Miata, the rev limiter is around 7,000 RPMs. So very typically you're going to see, 7,100, 7,000, 7,000. It's pretty consistent, right? Lap to lap. The maximum RPM that the engine reached during each lap is this number you're seeing here. And it's fairly consistent until we get down to the second session here, and you're going to see there's one number that stands out from the rest, right? So like I was saying before, with the spec Miata, the rev limiter is around the neighborhood of 7,000. We're seeing all that here except for this one pretty big number of 8,900. Since this number is so high, it must have been done on a downshift, right? So since that electronic rev limiter, at full throttle won't let the RPMs go past that 7,000 number, what this likely means is, we're going to take a look at this in the data right now, but what this means is the driver has basically selected a gear that's too low, and when he lets the clutch out, the rear tires are essentially forcing the engine to turn over that much. And one shortcut to get to the moment where it happened is, and this is probably one of my favorite things about the AIM software, is you can just double click that figure of 8,900, okay? And so what you've seen this do is this has actually moved the cursor directly over to this spot, all right? So you can see that the RPMs at this spot are really, really high compared to everywhere else. You can see these areas That's going to be around the neighborhood of 7,000. Those are the consistent shifts that we're liking to see, but obviously this stands out. So we're going to take a look at this. We're going to zoom in a little bit closer and see exactly what happened.
Jonathan's just using the little zoom tool up from the secondary icon toolbar to just drag along, and as soon as he lets off the cursor, boom, then he's zoomed into the area that he drug across.
Yeah, exactly. Another super helpful tool because you're able to see exactly what you want and nothing else. So the first thing we want to talk about is, you know, where are we on the track? What I've selected is pretty much the apex of turn 10 at Sebring. Turn 11 is a slight jog to the left. Certainly in a spec Miata, this should be a full throttle area. And then we have turn 13 at Sebring, which a lot of people call it water tower turn. And where the cursor is selected right now, which is at the peak RPM of this over rev, is going to be right, let's say about at the end of the exit curb for this turn 13 corner. All right. So right away, I can tell you from experience that this is about where the shift from third to fourth happens. So let's kind of see what happened. Let's analyze the data and see if that little piece of information comes into play here. So when he's coming out of the turn 10 area, you can see on the white lap, he had a good drive. If you look at his speed out of the turn, he was full throttle all the way through 10, out of 10 through 11. But on the red lap, he had a complete lift of the throttle here. Now, this could have been from a car in front of him, could have been just simply learning the new track because this was both one of his earlier sessions. And in the case of the red lap, he slowed enough that he was actually able to stretch third gear, okay, which isn't something that you'd normally do. Normally, with a good drive out of the turn in the spec Miatas, you would see a shift up to fourth gear, which is what you're seeing from the lift of the throttle. The gear selection indicator, you can see on the white, is going up to fourth gear, and the drop in the RPM. So we know on the white lap, he went up to fourth gear. Now, when you have some type of inconsistencies coming up to a corner, and let's say in this case, since he stretched third, normally you do a downshift coming up to the turn. In this case, he didn't have to. So he could have been mentally starting to be a little bit confused because his rhythm has been interrupted going into the turn. So, he's kind of starting to get a little bit confused about what gear he's in. So in the white occasion here, he goes up to fourth and back down to third gear for the turn. And in the other lap, he's staying in third gear. Now, when he comes out of the turn, you can see that in the red lap, he slowed quite a lot compared to the white lap. So obviously the RPM is lower. This is both going to be third gear. When he goes to do his shift into fourth gear, he definitely made an error here. And I can tell you, ask me how I know, but the shift from third to fourth in a Miata is you have to be slow and smooth with it. Number one, it's easy to grind the gear, but more importantly, it's easy to put it in second gear, which is exactly what happened here. So when he was going from third to fourth, he ended up going third to second. So this is where you see the rise in the RPM. You can take a look at what it does to his speed. If we look at if we compare the speeds, you get 79 versus 77 right before this mistake. And then I can just put the cursor just after the mistake. And now you can see we have 86 versus 72. Yeah. So this 14. Was obviously a significant mistake.
Yeah, 14 miles per hour off coming out.
Yeah, and that's a huge number, right?
Yeah.
2 miles an hour is about 3 feet per second. So you can imagine how much that slows them down.
Yeah.
All right. So that's a good example of how to find over revs. Again, the channels report is super handy. A lot of times if you come in off the track, you download the data, by default, it's going to show you the 2 best laps of each session when you load up the test. And it's important to look at the other laps. And of course you can go through that manually you can come over here and look at all the, check all the boxes from each session. But of course, that's pretty time consuming, which is why I like to use the channels report. Find the big numbers, find an over rev, which is no good for the motor, and make sure you're able to tell your engineers or crew chief about that.
Exactly. Or your rental car owner, right? Make sure they know too, right? Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
They're at the end of that straightaway. I see that the red line is flat and has some flutter to it over here towards the end. What happened there? They're about 17,000 feet or so, a little bit farther to the right. A little bit farther, yeah.
Right here?
Yeah, a little bit farther to the right, about 16,000 feet. Yeah, right in that area, right there. You see the RPM?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What is going on there?
So let's talk about that. I'm going to zoom in here. Let's see. Come on. There we go.
There you go.
All right. So when I zoom in, I like to get the straightaway before and it just after full throttle on the straightaway after. This is going to tell us kind of the whole story. What you're looking for here, this is the back straightaway between turns 16 and 17 at Sebring. Very long back straightaway, a lot of time to think about what you're doing. A lot of time to forget about your shifts, which is what you're going to see here on one of these occasions. You're looking at the speed, you're looking at the RPM. You start to see kind of 3/4 of the way down the back straightaway, you see this flutter in the RPM. And what this is this is the rev limiter, right? So this is the around 7,000, top of 4th gear. This is where the ignition is starting to cut the RPMs. Now, you're looking at the data, but you kind of want to know what it is in terms of something you can recognize and think about. And that's why I like to use this Delta tool, which basically is going to measure the time and distance that the car was on the rev limiter, right? So you can see that in this particular case, the driver was on the rev limiter for 483 feet or 3.1 seconds, right? Which is an eternity. Yeah. Sometimes there's some cases where, if you're hitting the rev limiter for 2 or 3 clicks, and you likely want to keep it in that gear and not worry about going up and back down again. But for the case of 500 feet, I have a feeling, and we're going to analyze this a little bit more, but I have a feeling that you're going to want to go up to 5th gear for that. So let's see if we can kind of prove that here. The one thing I want to look at is the time compare bar here, okay, during this shift. You can see that the time compare bar down the back straightaway is slowly going down or closer to 0. This means that the red lap is catching the white lap by a little bit. And this is due to the exit speed out of turn 16. He's carrying a little bit more speed. Now, when you use this Delta tool, let me put this back up here again. You're going to see that the red lap here is showing about 1/2 tenth quicker. And that's when he was on the rev limiter. Now you have to be careful here because this figure of 1/2 tenth quicker on the red lap is only from here to here. But the reason it's quicker is because he started this section at a higher speed from that exit. So what I like to do in order to directly compare, was it worth it to go up to the higher gear or was it worth it to stay in the gear? I'm going to look at the rate of acceleration from this point where the rev limiter started and where he went to 5th on the other lap versus right before he went to the brakes here. And you can see that in the lap that he was on the rev limiter, he gained -1 miles an hour, right? So he lost 1 mile an hour. Whereas in the white lap, the car continued to accelerate at 2.6, right? So this is a difference of 3 miles an hour that we can prove just if he takes the time to get to 5th gear. So really, really cool tool to use here in the RPM channels. I wanted to talk a little bit about, we talked about upshifting. I want to talk a little bit about downshifting. Let's zoom in here. We're gonna zoom in to turn 7 at Sebring. If you've driven Sebring, you obviously know what corner this is. It's very slow, long brake zone. I think it's actually slightly downhill, but the biggest thing is it's pretty bumpy in the brake zone. And one of the struggles that I have in the spec Miatas, and I remember having the IMSA Lights cars a little bit, is keeping the car stable under braking. And with a manual transmission car that's rear wheel drive, if you aren't getting the blips of the throttle correctly on your downshifts, you can actually lock the rear tires, which is the equivalent of pulling the handbrake up in a brake zone. So you've probably heard of that heel and toe technique before. This is an example where it's super, super important. If we look at the data here, going into turn 7, right? So you're coming this way, hard on the brakes. This will be a second gear turn, accelerating out. So this is what you're seeing. This is coming down the straightaway right before that turn. This is where the speed starts to drop, right? This is where he comes out of the gas on the red lap and the white lap. But what we're looking at here is the RPMs, right? So when you're looking for how a driver is doing his downshifts, you're looking for this rise in the RPM, right? So that means that on his blip of the throttle, the RPMs are coming up, right? And then there's a small little blip right here, RPMs come up a little bit more. He did a better job with his blips on the red lap. And the white lap, he didn't do as good a job because you can see the RPMs of the motor aren't coming up to match the RPM of the next lower gear. When we take a look at the actual amount that he was blipping the throttle, we can put the cursor right on that, and you're going to see, 16% throttle, right, on the red there. We got a number of 17, right? So that's not exactly quite what you're looking for. We have an 11. Generally speaking, I like to see drivers have between a 40 to 50% throttle blip. Obviously, it can vary a little bit, but at the end of the day, what matters most is, when that clutch is released after the downshift, are the RPMs matched to the road speed? And if you're earlier in the brake zone and you're doing your downshifts sooner in the brake zone, you usually want to have a little bit higher blip. Later in the brake zone, you usually want a little bit smaller blip, but we can definitely tell that this is definitely going to be too small of the blips because it's not getting the RPMs up to the desired RPM once the clutch is released. So this is where the driver is essentially pulling the handbrake on himself and making it much more difficult, right, to keep the car stable under braking, especially going over those bumps there.
Yeah, and I've seen a question in both the chat and in the Q&A. People are asking, and Jonathan and I actually spoke about this a little bit. This is the RPM, this is the throttle position trace itself. While we do get this bit of a rev limiter hit that looks very similar to this, not too sure what this is other than it was only once in this entire set of data. It's either a sensor problem or something happened there. We do not know exactly what that is. The other one that was kind of interesting to me, Jonathan, is to prove your point here, the driver did blip here on this red lap, but well after it, then all of a sudden the red RPM comes up, and exactly what you had just mentioned. He blipped the throttle, made the downshift, and then let the clutch out, and it pulled the RPM up, just not as much as what your almost 9,000 RPM with the misshift, but it did pull the RPM up to 6,200. Virtually with no throttle input. So the driver is chattering those rear tires. The car is going to be unstable, and everything that you just mentioned. So kind of interesting to see.
Yeah, exactly. And had he done a better job blipping the throttle, you'd see this little spike in the RPM a little bit more in line with the throttle. So
exactly.
Yeah, good stuff.
Yep.
So another thing I wanted to look at while we're here looking at this is the upshifts. So obviously this is something that is pretty important with regards to lap time, driver performance. How quickly is a driver doing the shift, especially in a manual transmission gearbox where you have 3 pedals. It's often overlooked, but it's worth more time than you think. And we're going to go talk a little bit about that. When you're coming out of turn 7 here in a spec Miata, you're in second gear, you're going up to third almost immediately, and then you have another upshift over to fourth. So what you're seeing is here's where he gets to full throttle after turn 7. This is his upshift from second to third on the white lap and on the red lap. You can see right away there's a distinct difference between these two shifts in terms of the time that he spent off throttle. So what I'm going to do is go over to the delta, and I'm going to compare the slow upshift first. I'll do one click and then a second click. And you're going to see that this shift happened over the course of 87 feet or 1 second. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is that when you're measuring how quickly a driver is doing their upshifts, you don't want to go off of feet or distance. You want to go off of time, right? Because coming out of a slower corner, if it takes you 0.3 to do an upshift out of a slower corner, that's a shorter amount of distance. In a faster corner, that's a larger amount of distance. So I always look for time. You know, how long is it taking the driver to do the upshift, to do the gear change? And 1 second is definitely going to be too long. Let's take a look at the other lap. Let's take a look at how long that took him. Yep, just got to re-hit the delta thing. There we go.
There you go.
Yeah, so 0.4 of a second, right? This is much closer to what I'd like to see. Typically, you want to shoot for 2 to 3/10 of a second if you have an experienced driver who's really used to the car. That tends to be what I like to see. You also have to keep in mind that in a Miata in particular, the shift from second to third is more difficult than that shift from third to fourth, because you have to go over and across the H pattern, whereas 3 to 4 is straight back. So that's certainly a variable. But this is something that I would tell my driver, especially since a spec Miata is a fairly forgiving car. As you can tell by that 9,000 RPM over rev, that you might want to think about trying, being conscious of not wasting time on those upshifts.
The data even shows the end result here a little bit, where let me turn that off for a second. When you come back here and oops, I missed it. Look at the white one where it kind of flattens out for just a little bit with the 3 or 4 tenths shift, and look at how flat and even loss of speed on the longer shift of the red lap. You can really see the difference, and that is just performance from here all the way down the next straightaway. So those shift points, when we were racing Spec Miata, and then all the cars beyond that we happened to get into, this was an area that we focused on quite a bit, because this it's really tied to your RPM channel. Obviously, it ended up being performance of tenths, multiple tenths per lap, if you were able to get the shifts right without beating on the transmission. So, very important point that Jonathan's made.
Yeah, for sure, and it's obviously, we're all competitive here, right? So we are racing at the end of the day. So it's certainly a good thing to look at. Obviously, the time it takes to upshift, but also, just as Roger pointed out, how that actually has an effect on performance.
Perfect. Are you have anything else to show in this data, or do we move on to the next data set?
No, we're ready for the next one, Roger.
There's a question, and I will do that. There's a question in the question and answer. In Spec Miata, are downshifts single or double clutch? And while Jonathan's kind of tackling that question a little bit, I'm gonna launch another poll and bring up the next data set. So we'll have a lot of stuff for you guys to be doing while we're doing this. Here's one. While let me set this up, Jonathan, then you can answer that question. How often do you look at your racing data? We got multiple choice here if you do a little bit different, but after each session, when I can, probably multiple times during the day, there's a number of options there. And if I don't hit one that's close enough that you would like to add in there, click on other, and then give us some feedback into the chat box. Go ahead and answer that question while I load up the next data set, Jonathan.
Yeah, certainly. So the question's, in a Spec Miata, are the downshifts single or double clutched? And it really depends on the brake zone. Technically, you can do either in any brake zone. The criteria that matters is when the clutch is being released, are the RPMs matched? Has the engine been revved up enough to meet the transmission road speed of the lower gear when we release that clutch? So typically in a longer brake zone, I use double clutch downshifts. If it's a long brake zone where you have the steering wheel straight, I find that I kind of am able to have the coordination to do both, to do the double clutch, excuse me. But if the brake zone is the least bit rushed or shorter, I do the blip with the clutch in, you know, the single clutch downshifts. But really, like I said, at the end of the day, what matters most, and the only thing that matters actually is that RPM matched. And if you have a particular way of driving that you like to do better, it's not wrong. You know, if you can get the RPM matched, you're going to be in good shape.
Exactly. Really, the bottom line is if you do your RPM matching well, the double clutch effect isn't needed, right? In the end, right? In a spec Miata, you know, there are other cars that might vary. I'm going to end that polling right now, and Jonathan is going to take a look at some new data sets. But I want to end this poll, and then I want to share it. I want to share the results of this one so everybody can take a look at it, and Jonathan can take a look as well. And when we put these videos out on YouTube, when the recorded version of this goes out onto YouTube, these results do not show. So I always like to talk a little bit about it. How often do you like looking at how often do you look at your racing data? And the #1 result here was at home after the track event at 59% of the users that responded to this. Sometimes you're just super busy in between sessions and you don't have time. The second place one was after each session on the track at 52%. I'm sorry, the second one was at the end of the track day at 57%. And the third place one was after each session at the track. So nobody talked about not downloading but reviewing my data right off the data logger. There is some value to that in certain types of data loggers we have, but nobody chose that one right now. And the other ones were pretty small, or just prior to the next track event was also in there, and when I can, multiple times during the day. So I appreciate that. That helps us understand where everybody's at. So I will stop sharing those results now. Thank you very much. And then put that back over here. And then Jonathan, if you could just introduce this data set. Let me get back over to the measures graph for you. Introduce this data set. Click on the mouse and let's chat a little bit about what we see here with in the RPM channel.
Yeah, for sure. So just a little bit about the background of what we're looking at here. This is Audubon Country Club Speedway, which is up kind of near the Chicago area. And this is in a Mustang Challenge car. We've used this data quite a bit actually in the AIM seminars. So we're going to be taking a look at what's going on here, and you're going to notice one thing that's different in the measures graph straight away is that we have now this gear selection indicator. And what you're looking for is any differences in gear selections. In this particular instance, the driver was learning the track in earlier qualifying session on the red laps, and then later in the weekend, looks like this was a race event, was in the white laps.
Yeah, don't know the driver's name's Cadell. I think it was me. I'm not too sure who is driving this, but no, it's my son's data, and who happens to have his birthday happening today. So happy birthday to Andrew, by the way.
Oh,
and
happy birthday.
yeah, so now we'll pick on him. So go ahead.
Exactly. One heck of a birthday present.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so I'm going to use the zoom tool here just to zoom into the area that we're looking at. And again, we're looking at where was the gear different lap to lap, and then also the straightaway before and after that event is kind of where I like to look at. So right away, we can take a look at the track map again, just to kind of reorient ourselves. This is turns 8, 9, 10 at Audubon Country Club. Very technical section, and it's a lot slower than it looks. Ask me how I know. And it can catch you off guard. This is definitely also a corner complex where I'd say it's a textbook example of should you be in second gear or should you be in third gear. And this is something that you might not be able to tell seat of the pants, you know, which is better. You can tell what feels better, but you can't tell what's actually better. So this is one instance that the data analysis is going to be super helpful. So we're going to take a look at, you know, what happened. I'm going to put the cursor here. So this is right before he goes to the brake zone for turn 8. We got turns 9 and 10 here. So during the turn 8 brake zone, you can see he got in the brakes pretty hard, maybe a little bit harder actually on the red lap. But the biggest difference is he has this second downshift. So we can tell by the gear indicator, he went down into second. We can tell by the throttle blip, right? The second throttle blip. Here's the first downshift, but here's the second one on the red lap. And then also the spike in the RPM. All tell us he went down to second gear. Now, this is also a manual transmission 3-pedal car. So you are implementing the heel toe downshift, which means typically when you reach for the throttle blip, it's all too easy to hang on the brake longer and end up slowing the car more. So the advantage to the second downshift would be that you get a little bit more torque, a little bit better drive out of the corner. But the disadvantage is, in order to coordinate that downshift, you might end up hanging on the brake a little longer. And this is exactly what happened here. That second downshift caused him to continue to slow the car more, whereas after the first downshift into third, he was able to kind of roll the car across the apex. Now, I talked a little bit about how second gear might have a better drive out of the corner, and you can see it absolutely does, right? He has lower min speed, right? But he's able to really put power down. Actually, you get to initial throttle a little sooner, full power at the same time. And because of the higher RPM, what we're seeing here, the engine definitely pulled out of the corner a little bit. And what's interesting is we're actually going to see the same pattern of slower in, faster out, kind of repeating itself through here. This one little hiccup here, he thought about getting to throttle, but thought better of it. But generally speaking, the entry is a little slower. The drive out of the corner is a little better. Same thing with turn 10. So when we're comparing entry exit speed balance, we want to see, what was better. I'm going to use the delta function again to see what was faster. And it looks like the red lap was 0.4 slower, okay? So this is building a case for not doing that second downshift, for keeping the car in third gear and rolling some sort of speed across the apex. It turned out to be a net gain to do that, number one, from a lap time perspective, but number two, from a consistency perspective, right? So when you're down in that lower gear, the RPMs are higher, there's a lot of noise, there's more vibration, the throttle is more responsive, and that can be a bad thing if you're trying to balance the platform of the car. Whereas in the higher gear, you're going to be more consistent. Throttle isn't as responsive, but that's okay because you're not even at full throttle yet, so you don't necessarily need that. And just remember that the power is only good if you can put it actually to the road. Another thing I like to do, using the delta function again, is I want to know how much time or distance was there between where the driver got to full throttle out of turn 10 and when they did their first upshift. So if you think about it for a minute, if you're in a gear that's too low, you're going to get to full throttle and pretty much immediately pull a shift. And if that's the case, it's likely to be the higher gear. I'll use the delta here. So I'll go to the first point is just after he gets to full throttle out of 10. And then the second point will be just before he does that first upshift. This was at 1.4 seconds between full throttle and upshift, or 132 feet. So pretty safe to say that third gear is going to be the way to go, looking at the time compare bar and just thinking about consistency and thinking about the fact that, when you get to throttle, you don't want to immediately have to let off and do another upshift at that point.
Exactly. The data here it's interesting that you can see where there are times when the red one was faster, like Jonathan talked about, and he showed it up here on the speed trace, but the time compare bar goes down. But overall, the rolling through it in that higher gear, allowing the platform to be a little bit more stable and getting back to the throttle a little bit earlier, it ends up being faster. Yeah, it's just 2 laps, and we'd want to maybe look at another lap or two to do it. But these are those decisions that have to be made in the RPM in which gear you go through a corner that is hard to feel inside the car because the car's making noise. It feels like you're really accelerating and all that, but yet you can't tell if it was faster in each gear. Almost always when you're when you're trying to understand that in the car, maybe during mid-race, you're trying to figure something out first few practice sessions, it almost always is better to err to rolling one gear higher. It just because of the physics and the noise and everything that's going on can almost lie to you as a driver, make you think you're going faster than what you are. So appreciate that, Jonathan. Anything else you want to add about this particular data set?
Just confirming what you're saying, I can tell you I've made more mistakes through missed shifts than I have getting the throttle a little sooner. So
boy, and they're more costly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, one thing I just noticed too, Roger, is after this area we're talking about where he gets to full throttle and he's doing that shift, I just noticed on all the occasions where he's doing these two upshifts, the RPM is climbing nice and linear, relative to the speed. But then right before the shift, there's kind of a brief little spike in the RPM right before he goes to shift. So what this is, and I've seen this a few times with drivers, and what's happening is the RPM is coming up without the road speed. And the only way that can be happening is if the driver is kind of anticipating the shift a little bit and actually depressing that clutch a little bit before he lets off the gas to change to the next gear. So that's something that, again, seat of the pants, you'd never be able to feel, you'd never be able to really see that is happening. And it's something that can be overlooked and end up having a negative consequence to vehicle health down the road.
Yeah, again, this is my son's data, and we've seen it a lot. What sometimes you look at those channel reports and you're looking for the high RPM, and if we were to zoom in, you will get the RPM that's up here at this peak, and it's the 6495 number, right? But in reality, he started his shift back here at 6,000. There's a $4,000 at 4,000. That's Freudian slip there, right? 4,000 RPM false lie here. That is, if you were betting everything on just some digital numbers, you would be picking this peak and not where he actually started the shift. So if you see these, and I see this more often than not, I've seen it certainly with this driver a lot. We found very early in his driving career, Spec Miata, that boy, the faster we could shift, the more lap time that made, and there was zero doubt in his mind when he was racing around other cars. So that was something he focused on a lot. Because of that, he's putting the clutch in before he's let the throttle fully off. You're always getting this little tip where it goes up like that. It's harder on the clutch. There's some bad things, but maybe it does facilitate a faster and more smooth and consistent shift. So you have to balance that out. So it's up to you or your team owner or your transmission builder, right? So, so you figure it out. So
yeah, you might get a different answer depending on whether you ask the driver or the engineer.
There you go. I'm going to do another poll here while we load up another data set. This one here is we just did data analysis frequency. How often are you doing it? I'm gonna load up another one as I load the next test up. And this one is when analyzing your data, what functions do you use the most? And it's multiple choice. So go ahead and pick some of these different functions, things you use inside of Race Studio 2. There it goes. You have some options. If something's not in there that you do like to use, I didn't even use the other button here, but if there's something you like to use in the software that I didn't list there, go ahead and throw it into the chat box. Meanwhile, I'm going to go ahead and close this. There's one more one more question in the question and answer, Jonathan, as I'm doing this. Shouldn't the driver work harder, talking about this data we just looked at, shouldn't the driver work harder and improve, I'll put some more words in there, at not overslowing when doing that extra downshift? Is that the resolution, or is the resolution not to do the downshift?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that kind of depends what actually happens, right? So obviously the goal is, at the end of the day, is to reach the proper entry exit speed balance. So I would say that if 9 times out of 10, always go with the higher gear, okay? Because you're gonna make less mistakes in the long run, and it's gonna end up being a little bit more consistent, right? If you try and coordinate with some fancy footwork, getting that extra blip while you're coming off the brake, It's something that can be learned, but typically it's going to be a net loss, right? And it's something that I'd recommend just staying in the higher gear 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, the whole point of there was two levels of discussion on it. Number one was, is it better overall? And that extra slowing because of maybe some poor technique on that, that may or may not have been exactly what it was, but it was, the bigger picture was, gosh, the series of corners running it through it in those 2 different gears, which was better. So certainly, Francis, if the driver's going to use that technique and wanted to be in that next gear lower, then the next thing to do is to work on the technique. We do have a poll up there. I've opened up that data. We'll get ready to take a look at it here in a second. But I want to finish that poll. I'm going to end it and then give everybody, share the results with everybody. The literally 100% of you that answered use the measures graph. That is really pretty much home base in Race Studio. That's that's where the squiggly lines are. The next one is the time compare bar, which is inside of the measures graph. So and that is what I've always called one of the most powerful tools of Race Studio, and where a lot of people ought to be working, which we have looked at today as well. And then the next one is the split report. We've had entire webinars based on looking at that split report and how that kind of works. So that's good. And the next one was the channels report, and then math channels. Channel report at 42% and math channels at 39%. So I do appreciate that. Hopefully you guys got a chance to look at that and understand what's happening there. We have been using these kind of polls to help us plan our future webinars. So that's very thankful to you for filling those out. The next data set is going to be is some data that what we wanted to look at is and find for our last example, and we've got about 5 minutes or so that we want to talk about this one. It was our last example that and one of the more important ones that we wanted. We were looking for some data that had a driver testing and practicing and trying some different things of maybe rolling through, go ahead and downshifting on one and then see what in a corner and not in another, and not a series of corners like we did with the Mustang data just now. So this is some data from one of your favorite tracks, right? Right, Jonathan, Watkins Glen. Got some auto scaling we can do. Go ahead and set this screen up and let's chat about this one for a little bit.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Roger. Yep. Let me got the mouse there. Okay. So yeah, sometimes you're going to load up a test here, and for whatever reason, you're just going to see that the scaling might be a bit off. You can see how the GPS speed is kind of coming out of sight there. You can adjust this manually over here, but one quick way to do it is to just double click on the scale here, and you're going to see it just automatically rescaled. So very handy way of just quickly doing that. We can actually do the same thing with the RPM. You see how there's a lot of space up here. Go ahead and just make that a little bit more visually friendly. So yeah, again, we just want to talk about one more thing here. As you always do when you're looking at RPM analysis, you look for differences in RPM where you don't have differences in speed. So in this example, you can see that the RPM is, of course, lower through here, which is going to be the bus stop chicane at the Glen. That's because he's in the same gear, but there's less speed. In this case, when we add the laces of the boot and the toe of the boot, you can see the speed is very similar, yet the RPM is different. So what this means is that the driver has chosen a different gear. And this is in a Porsche 914 too. So this is something that you really want to make sure you're accurate with your shifts. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a bit. Again, I like to get the majority of the straightaway before and after the area that you're looking at. So you can see this has changed the GPS map a little bit. I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit. We're going to talk about this, the laces of the boot here. And the first thing you can see right away is that the driver, the same driver, but he had a little bit of a earlier line. He brought the car down to the apex a little sooner, and he might have run out of road at the exit a little bit. So let's go see if that's the case. I can tell right away he's having trouble getting to throttle, right? So this is likely due to too early of a line. But let's take a look at another step back and see what he has done with his gear changes. One thing I see is it looks like he's actually bleeding out of the throttle a little bit before he goes to the brakes for real. This is something that I see pretty common. Actually, people are coming down the straightaway, kind of anticipating the brake zone, so they start cheating out of the gas. You want to make sure you're full throttle up to that brake point. The other thing we're looking at is a gear change. Obviously, you can see he goes down one gear. You can tell from gear selection, throttle blip, and the increase in the RPM, right? So what does that do to his speed? Just like we were talking about before, if you do that downshift, you have a tendency to stay on the brake a little longer, right? So you can see his speed is continuing to fall. Whereas in the white lap, he's not thinking about the downshift. He did keep the car a little bit higher in the entry to the corner. All right, but he's not thinking about that downshift. He's not worried about is the downshifting affecting what I'm doing with the brake pedal, right? He's able to kind of come off that brake and start slowing the car less on the entry to the turn here. Now we can take a look at just simply the shift right here, right? The upshift out of the turn. I'm not even really going to talk about exit speed right now. I just want to take a look at what the shift is gonna do down the straightaway here. If we use the Delta tool, we go right before his upshift, right before he lifts off the throttle for the next turn, and you can see that he has basically slowed down a tenth, right, because of that upshift, right? So in the white lap, he gained 16 miles an hour from this point to that point. And on the red lap, he gained 14, right? So we can tell pretty much straight away that from that factor alone, it's 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be worth it to go down that lower gear. A, because you're going to have to hang on the brake a little longer, and B, you're going to have to do that shift anyway. So even if you get a phenomenal exit out, even if you're able to get to throttle, maybe with a better line, it's likely not going to be worth it.
Again, so when there's a tie in your mind of thinking either way, it's almost always going to go to the not downshifting and try to roll through the corner a little bit better. It's amazing how often that ends up being true.
Yeah, for sure. So what I want to talk about lastly here is just the toe of the boot real quick. We're going to basically be talking about something pretty similar. You can see that at the exit of the turn, we'll talk about that for right away here. A big drop in speed, right? So what's happened here? Why is the driver looks like he's doing a downshift at the exit of the turn? Okay, let's take a step back and figure out why. You can see he's going to the brakes here. Here's the downshift on the red lap. RPMs come up. On the white lap, looks like he went for the downshift with throttle blip. He actually had 2 small ones there, but the RPM dropped pretty significantly. So it looks like to me like he put the car in the same gear during that downshift, right? So of course he's coming up the hill, and we all know coming up this hill here at Watkins Glen, especially in a spec Miata, I can tell you it feels like an eternity, right? It feels very, very slow coming out, even when you do it right. So when you're down in, let's say, 3,800 RPM in this Porsche 914. I mean, it's you're not pulling up the hill very much. It wouldn't go into gear. Now you see he tries to make up for it, obviously, by doing this downshift, but by then the exit's pretty shot here. So.
Yeah, interesting. This is data that we have shown in the past, obviously, in several other webinars. Our friend Matt Romanowski allows us to use this data to take a look at a couple things. It's a great track. We love to look at to use Watkins Glen as well. And what I love about this is Matt is out there and he's getting a couple of laps in practice, and he's just trying some different things, and then able to go back and look at the data and go, well, that I think it worked, but let's look at the data and figure out that no, that was kind of wrong. Next time we go back out, we're going to adjust to the different way. So I love that. So perfect. Anything else in that data set you want to look at, Jonathan, or was that about it?
Yeah, that's it for detailed analysis. Just generally speaking, I pretty much showed you guys how I've used the RPM channel for various aspects of driver performance. How quickly is the driver upshifting? Are they choosing the right gear for the turn? Is the RPM correct coming out of the corner? And most importantly, debatably, is the engine going to make it all weekend? so for over revs. So.
Another very, very important part, right? So as we kind of start to go towards the end, closing out this webinar, I have one more topic that I would like to ask you to take a look at and vote on in the poll. This is what are the top 3 topics you'd like to see future AIM Sports LearnFast webinars. I've got a list that we're planning on these at least through probably the maybe even the end of July on the current schedule. We'll start to tweak and adjust. Maybe we'll have a poll here at the one on Thursday. We'll talk about in just a second of what what do you think about continuing on 2 a week, or do we want to drop back to 1 a week? Everybody's getting hopefully soon we'll be out at the track and maybe we slow them down, but maybe we keep doing them. I'll leave that up to you in another one. Future webinar topics, the pick the top 3, top 4, whatever works for you. And if other is if you don't see your topic you'd love to see, make sure you put it into the chat box as well. We'll let that go for a minute. I'm going to switch my screen behind the scenes here and get back to the presentation materials. Let me do that. Let me do this. While you guys are answering that poll, we will go here. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll in just a couple of seconds if you haven't had a chance to finish your voting. And let's end that polling and then let's share it. And let's let everybody take a look at what some of the ideas are. Number 1 is, as it has been almost every time we've done this poll, is data analysis. You've got this great hardware and you've got it installed and you really want that added value of learning a little bit more about the analysis side, and we certainly understand that, and that's what you see that in our trends of how we put together these webinars. Certainly there are other things we want to talk about and people want to see, configurations and calibrations and track maps and other things, but data analysis is always way up there on the list at 73% for today's poll. The next one looks like it's 35% on track maps. People are still really wanting even a little bit more information. We've got a couple of webinars where we've hit track maps pretty darn hard. Watch those if you haven't seen them, and give me some ideas on what we may have missed or what else you might want covered. Next 2 that are pretty close, ECU protocols. We've got that one scheduled on the list in the next week or 2, and so be ready for that. SmartyCam setup. We've talked a little bit about SmartyCams, but more of how to use them than actually go through the setup side of it a little bit, but we'll look into that. And then and that looks like it's about close. Configurations, calibrations, there's some other numbers in there, but I do appreciate you everybody. We did 4 polls today, and that we're looking for some more information, and that's why we kind of hit them up a little bit, but it's very helpful to us, so thank you. Every one of these, and by the way, this is number 25 that we have done so far of these webinars. We started these in March, and we couldn't travel. We couldn't do our normal seminars that are on site, so we started to do these, and we did those, and then we broke pretty quickly in April to doing one every 2 weeks, two a week, and we've been going like crazy with it. So enjoying doing them. We record them all and we put them out onto our YouTube site. Robbie has put the link up there again for you in the chat box. Go visit that, and sometimes we go through some of these things in a hurry, and we understand that. We're trying to get as much into these 1-hour sessions more or less as we can, and and making sure you have the ability to go back and review and slow it down and maybe replay a couple of times, see things like that. So go visit the video site there on YouTube from AIM Data. We also just want to make sure that you're clear. This isn't all we do. We certainly, this is a small piece of it, but we have guys that are heading out to the racetrack. That's always been our policy, to be out there, help the end user, make sure they get as much out of our equipment as you can. If you haven't made it to the track yet, or you don't see us at the track, give our 800 number a call. As we like to say, we're a customer support company that happens to sell racing electronics. So make sure you give us a holler. We're always there to help you and make sure that these things are working and doing what you expect them to do. The next webinar. The next webinar on Thursday, June 25th, is going to be by Ray Phillips. This is his second or third one that he's done with us. The last one he did, which was we talked a lot about the track report function and just making more power out of, how to use track maps and how to get even more power. The feedback we got from that was extremely good, and so Ray has taken some of that information, and he had another topic that he really wanted to dig into a little bit deeper and give you some more information and kind of cool ways of looking at your data. So what we're calling this one is measuring performance in Ray Studio 2 analysis. Not just use the, obviously we're using the analysis, Ray Studio 2 analysis. He wants to give you some direct things that you can create and then measure your performance and give, definable outcomes where you can go back into the car and do some different things. He's got some pretty cool tips and tricks that he's going to talk about this coming Thursday, June 25th, at the same time that we do all of these, 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So looking forward to Ray's next webinar here with us in just a couple of days. So looking forward to that. I appreciate everybody coming. I even more so, Jonathan, it's been we talked about this quite some time ago. Your schedule's busy. We had a full slate at some level, so I'm glad we were finally able to get together with you. There's Jonathan's email address. Jonathan has that entire free wisdom page that's on his jonathangoring.com website, his motorsports site, and just tons of good information in there. Jonathan, you have anything else you'd like to add as we're kind of closing this up?
Oh, just thank you for the opportunity. This was fun. It's, I hope that everybody enjoyed it and we were able to help show how to use the software. I use it almost every day actually at the track. So it's definitely something I couldn't go without.
Well, I appreciate you coming. I know it's a lot of work to put it all together, and but your work is appreciated by certainly all of us, and I know by the hundreds of people that are going to be either watch today or will be watching it in the future on YouTube. So thank you very much for doing what you do. I appreciate that. So that'll be it for today. Looking forward to seeing you all again in a couple of days on Thursday, and with Ray. And everybody go out and have a good day, and we'll see you at the next one.